The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of the dusty general store, and Lillian Everett stepped down into the unforgiving heat of Hachita, New Mexico, with 3 exhausted children clinging to her skirts and not a penny left to her name. The June sun of 1883 beat down mercilessly as she surveyed the small frontier town that was supposed to be her salvation, though at the moment it looked more like the edge of the world where hope went to die. Her late husband's brother had promised her work and a place to stay in his boarding house, but as she stood there with 7-year-old Emma, 5-year-old Thomas, and 3-year-old Sarah pressing against her dusty traveling dress, she wondered if the letter had been nothing more than empty words written by a man who never expected her to actually make the journey. The town consisted of little more than a main street lined with weathered buildings that looked ready to collapse under their own weight, and beyond that stretched endless miles of desert scrubland, dotted with mesquite and creosote bushes. Lillian adjusted the bonnet on her head and tried to ignore the stares of the men lounging outside the saloon across the street. She had grown accustomed to those looks during the 2 weeks of travel from St. Louis, the mixture of curiosity and judgment that followed a woman traveling alone with children and no visible husband to protect her. "Mama, I am thirsty," Sarah whimpered, tugging on Lillian's sleeve with small, dirty fingers. "I know, sweetheart. We will find Uncle Robert, and then we will all have something to drink," Lillian promised, though her own throat felt like sandpaper and her head pounded from dehydration and worry. She picked up the smallest of their bags and guided her children toward the general store, hoping someone inside could direct her to Robert's boarding house. The other passengers from the stage had already dispersed, locals who knew exactly where they were going, leaving her standing alone and uncertain. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and a small bell announced their arrival. Inside, the store was dimly lit and packed with goods from floor to ceiling, everything from canned goods to farming equipment to bolts of fabric. An older woman with gray hair pinned severely back looked up from behind the counter, her expression neither welcoming nor hostile, just tired. "Help you? I am looking for Robert Everett's boarding house," Lillian said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "I am his sister-in-law, and he is expecting me." The woman's expression shifted to something that might have been pity. "Robert Everett passed on about 3 months back. Heart gave out one night while he was sleeping. Never woke up." The words hit Lillian like a physical blow, and she felt the world tilt dangerously. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself while her children pressed closer, sensing their mother's distress. 3 months. He had been dead 3 months, and his letter had arrived just 6 weeks ago. Someone must have mailed it after his death, or perhaps it had been delayed in transit. Either way, the result was the same. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles with 3 small children, spent the last of her money on stage fare, and arrived at a destination where no one was expecting her, and no one was waiting to help. "The boarding house closed up after he died," the woman continued, her tone slightly gentler now. "His creditors took most everything. I am sorry you came all this way for nothing." Lillian felt hot tears prick at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough tears in the year since Jacob had died from the influenza that swept through their neighborhood, taking him and leaving her with 3 children to feed, and a landlord who had no patience for widows who could not pay their rent. She had cried when she sold everything they owned, when she packed up the small life they had built, when she said goodbye to the only home her children had ever known. She would not cry now, not in front of strangers, not in front of her babies who needed her to be strong. "Is there any work in town?" she asked, lifting her chin. "I can cook, clean, so keep accounts. I am a hard worker and I need to provide for my children." The woman behind the counter shook her head slowly. "Hachita is not much of a town, as you can see. Most folks do for themselves. The saloon might need help, but that is no place for a woman with children." Lillian nodded, though her mind was racing. She could not take her children into a saloon, could not expose them to that environment even if it meant they ate. There had to be another option. There had to be something. "Where might I find lodging for tonight?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The hotel closed last year. Some folks rent rooms, but you would need to ask around." The woman paused, studying Lillian's face, and the children clustered around her. "There is a man named Quinton Keller who runs a ranch about 5 miles outside town. He comes in for supplies every Saturday. Lost his wife in childbirth 2 years back, and his mother who was helping him passed this spring. Word is he is looking for someone to help with the house and cooking, someone who could look after things proper. He has been managing alone, but a ranch is too much for one man to handle without help." Hope flickered in Lillian's chest, small but determined. "When does he come to town?" "Should be in tomorrow morning early. He is usually here by sunrise to get his business done before the heat of the day." The woman hesitated, then added, "You and the children can sleep in my back room tonight if you need. I have some space among the storage." "It is not comfortable, but it is better than the street." Relief flooded through Lillian so powerfully that she felt her knees weaken. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. I can pay you." She reached into her bag where she had hidden her last few coins, emergency money she had sworn not to touch unless absolutely necessary. The woman waved her hand dismissively. "Keep your money. You will need it more than I do. I am Margaret, and you can call me that. What are your names?" "I am Lillian, and these are Emma, Thomas, and Sarah." She placed a hand on each child's head in turn, and they looked up at Margaret with wide, uncertain eyes. "Well then, Lillian, let us get you and these little ones some water and something to eat. You all look about ready to collapse." Margaret came around the counter and ushered them toward the back of the store. "I have some bread and cheese, and I can heat up some beans. It is not fancy, but it will fill your stomachs." As Margaret busied herself with preparing food, Lillian sank onto a wooden crate and let herself breathe for the first time since stepping off that stage. The children gathered around her, and she pulled them close, pressing kisses to their dusty foreheads. They had survived the journey, and now they would survive this setback. She would meet this Quinton Keller in the morning, and she would convince him that she was exactly what he needed. She had to. There was no other option. That night, after the children had eaten and been washed as best as possible with a basin of water, Lillian tucked them into makeshift beds among the storage crates and sacks of flour. She lay awake long after they had fallen asleep, listening to their soft breathing and planning what she would say to this rancher tomorrow. She needed to present herself as capable, reliable, someone who could manage a household and earn her keep. She needed to convince him that 3 children would be an asset rather than a burden, though she knew that would be the hardest sell of all. The first light of dawn was just beginning to color the eastern sky when Lillian woke her children and helped them dress in their least wrinkled clothes. She braided Emma's hair with shaking fingers and used a damp cloth to clean the dirt from Thomas's face, while Sarah clung to her skirt and whimpered sleepily. Margaret appeared with fresh bread and milk, which they ate quickly before Margaret positioned them near the front window where they could watch for Quinton Keller's arrival. "He drives a wagon pulled by 2 bay horses," Margaret explained. "You cannot miss him. Tall man, dark hair, keeps to himself mostly. He is not unfriendly, just quiet. Lost his wife young and it changed him. But he is fair and he treats people decent. If he says he will do something, you can count on it." Lillian nodded. absorbing this information and trying to calm the butterflies rioting in her stomach. The sun climbed higher, and the street began to come alive with the slow activity of a small frontier town. A few people passed by, glancing curiously at the woman and children standing in the window of the general store, but no one stopped to ask questions. Then she saw him. A wagon rolled down the main street pulled by two horses exactly as Margaret had described, and the man driving it sat straight-backed and solid, his hat pulled low against the rising sun. Even from a distance, Lillian could see the breadth of his shoulders and the capable way he handled the reins. He pulled the wagon to a stop directly in front of the general store, and Lillian's heart began to pound so hard she felt certain everyone could hear it. Quinton Keller climbed down from the wagon with easy grace despite his size, and Lillian got her first clear look at him. He was probably in his early 30s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck, where it brushed his collar. His face was angular and strong-featured, marked by the weather and hard work, and there was a sadness in his eyes that spoke of losses that had not quite healed. He wore simple ranch clothes, denim pants and a blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms, and his boots were scuffed and practical. Margaret opened the door and called out to him. "Quinton, got someone here who needs to speak with you." He looked up, his gaze moving from Margaret to Lillian and the three children clustered behind her. Something flickered across his face, too quick for Lillian to identify, and then his expression settled back into neutral wariness. "Morning, Margaret," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in Lillian's chest. "What can I do for you?" "Not me. This is Lillian Everett, and she came here looking for Robert Everett's boarding house, not knowing he had passed. She is looking for work, and I thought of you, seeing as you mentioned needing help at the ranch." Quinton's dark eyes fixed on Lillian, and she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily despite the urge to look away. She could see him assessing her, taking in her worn but clean dress, her straight posture, and the children half hidden behind her skirts. The silence stretched out uncomfortably until finally he spoke. "I was thinking more along the lines of hiring a man for ranch work." "I can do ranch work," Lillian said quickly, then amended, "or at least I can learn. But what I am truly good at is running a household. I can cook, clean, do laundry, mend clothes, keep accounts, tend a garden, preserve food for winter." "Margaret mentioned you lost your mother recently, and before that your wife. A ranch needs more than just someone to work the cattle and fix fences. It needs someone to manage the house, to make sure there are proper meals and clean clothes and order to daily life. That is what I can provide." Quinton was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. 3 children is a lot of extra mouths to feed. 3 children is also 3 extra pairs of hands, Lillian countered, surprised by her own boldness. "Emma is 7 and already knows how to help with cooking and minding her siblings. In a few years, Thomas will be old enough to help with outdoor work. And Sarah is no trouble at all. We would earn our keep, I promise you that. We are hard workers, all of us, and we need this chance." She hated the pleading note that crept into her voice on that last sentence, but she could not help it. Everything depended on this moment, on this stranger's decision. If he turned her away, she had nowhere else to go. Quinton looked at the children again, and Lillian saw his jaw tighten. "You got references. My husband died a year ago from influenza. Before that, I ran our household in St. Louis and took in sewing to help make ends meet. After he passed, I tried to manage alone, but the expenses were too much. Robert Everett was my husband's brother, and he wrote saying he could give me work and a place to stay. I sold everything we owned to make the journey here, only to discover he had died months ago. She lifted her chin. "I am not asking for charity, Mr. Keller. I am asking for a fair wage and a chance to prove that I can do the work you need done. If after a month you are not satisfied, I will leave and you will owe me nothing." She saw something shift in his eyes, a softening around the edges that gave her a flutter of hope. He removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that spoke of uncertainty and internal debate. "The ranch is 5 miles outside town," he said slowly. "It is isolated. Just me and the livestock and a whole lot of emptiness. It is not an easy life." "I did not come to New Mexico expecting easy," Lillian replied. "I came expecting to work hard and build something better for my children. If you can offer us that opportunity, we will not disappoint you." Quinton replaced his hat and looked away, his gaze traveling down the dusty street as if seeking answers in the morning light. Finally, he turned back to her and gave a short nod. "All right. We can try it for a month and see how it goes. I can offer room and board for all of you and wages of $20 a month. You would have your own space in the house, separate from mine. I expect 3 solid meals a day, house kept clean, laundry done proper, and general management of the household. In return, I provide food, shelter, and protection for you and your children. That sound fair? $20 a month plus room and board. It was more than fair. It was salvation." "Yes," Lillian said, her voice thick with relief. "Yes, that sounds very fair. Thank you, Mr. Keller." "Thank you so much, Quinton," he corrected. "If we are going to be sharing a house, might as well use given names. You can gather your things and we will head out once I have loaded up the supplies I came for." Lillian turned to collect their meager belongings while Margaret smiled at her with warm approval. The children, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, suddenly came alive with questions and excitement. Emma tugged on Lillian's sleeve and whispered, "Is he going to be our new papa?" "No, sweetheart," Lillian said quietly, kneeling down to look her daughter in the eye. "Mr. Keller is giving us work and a place to stay, but he is our employer, not family. We must be respectful and helpful and show him that we are worth the chance he is taking on us. Do you understand?" Emma nodded solemnly and Thomas piped up, "I can help with chores. I am strong." "I know you are, love. You are all going to be such good helpers." Lillian kissed each of their foreheads and then stood, squaring her shoulders. This was a new beginning, a chance to build stability for her children. She would not waste it. Within 20 minutes, Quinton had loaded his supplies into the wagon and helped Lillian and the children climb aboard. Their few bags were stowed in the back, and Sarah settled into Lillian's lap while Emma and Thomas squeezed in beside her on the wooden seat. Quinton climbed up beside them, taking the reins with practiced ease, and with a click of his tongue, the horses started forward. Lillian glanced back only once at Hachita as they left the town behind, then turned her face forward toward whatever lay ahead. Beside her, Quinton sat silent and focused on the road, his profile strong and certain against the brightening sky. She knew nothing about this man except that he had shown her kindness when he could have easily turned her away. That was enough for now. It had to be. The journey to the ranch took nearly an hour, following a rutted track that wound through scrubland and past occasional stands of cottonwood trees that indicated underground water. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, so different from the tree-lined streets of St. Louis that it might have been a different world entirely. The children chattered excitedly at first, pointing out jackrabbits and hawks, but as the heat climbed and the rocking of the wagon lulled them, they grew quiet and drowsy. Quinton did not speak much during the drive, only occasionally pointing out a landmark or warning about a rough patch in the road. Lillian appreciated the silence, using the time to observe him, and try to get a sense of the man who was now her employer. His hands on the reins were strong and sure, with calluses that spoke of hard physical labor. He sat with the easy posture of someone completely at home in this environment, unbothered by the heat or the dust or the isolation. There was a quietness to him that seemed less like shyness and more like self-containment, as if he had learned to be comfortable with his own company after losing the people he loved. Finally, the ranch came into view, and Lillian sat up straighter to take it all in. The main house was a low, adobe structure with a covered porch running along the front, simple but solid. Nearby stood a barn, several corrals, and a few outbuildings, all showing signs of being well maintained despite the harsh environment. Trees had been planted around the house, probably cottonwoods given water from a well, and they provided precious shade that made the whole place seem more hospitable. "It is not much," Quinton said, speaking for the first time in miles, "but it is sound and it keeps out the weather." "It looks wonderful," Lillian said honestly. After sleeping in a storage room and facing the possibility of sleeping in the street, the simple ranch house looked like a palace. Quinton pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch and climbed down, then reached up to help Lillian and the children descend. His hands were warm and solid as they gripped her waist to lift her down, and Lillian felt an unexpected flutter in her stomach at the contact. She quickly dismissed the feeling, focusing instead on gathering the children and their belongings. "Let me show you inside," Quinton said, leading the way up the porch steps. The front door opened into a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy table surrounded by chairs in the center. The furniture was simple and masculine, but everything was surprisingly clean given that the man had been living alone. "I have been doing my best to keep things in order," Quinton explained, perhaps sensing her surprise. "But I am better with horses than housework, truth be told. There are 2 bedrooms off the main room. I use the one on the left. The one on the right was my mother's, and before that it was meant to be a nursery." His voice caught slightly on that last word, a hint of old pain. "You and the children can have that room. It is bigger than mine and there is space for all of you." He pushed open the door to reveal a spacious room with 2 windows that let in natural light and a large bed against one wall. There was also a dresser, a washstand, and enough floor space for bedrolls for the children until other arrangements could be made. "This is perfect," Lillian said softly. "Thank you, Quinton. Truly," he nodded, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I will get your bags and then show you around the rest of the place. Kitchen is fairly well stocked. I shoot rabbits and occasionally deer for meat, and I keep chickens for eggs. There is a root cellar out back that stays cool even in summer. Well water is clean and good. Outhouse is behind the barn." As he spoke, Lillian moved through the main room, taking mental inventory of what was there and what would be needed. The stove looked functional but could use a good cleaning. The dishes were mismatched but adequate. The floors were swept but would benefit from a thorough scrubbing. It was clear that Quinton had been doing the bare minimum to keep himself alive and the house functional, but there was no warmth here, no sense of it being a real home. That would change, she promised herself. She would make this place comfortable and welcoming, would show Quinton that hiring her had been the right decision. Quinton brought in their bags and then took them on a tour of the property. He showed them the barn where several horses nickered curiously at the newcomers, the chicken coop where the hens were already settling in for the afternoon heat, and the vegetable garden that was struggling but not entirely dead. Thomas was immediately fascinated by everything, asking endless questions about the animals and the ranch work, while Emma stayed close to Lillian's side and Sarah demanded to be carried. I usually tend the stock early morning and evening when it is cooler, Quinton explained. During the heat of the day, I work on repairs and maintenance or ride out to check on the cattle grazing on the rangeland. You and the children should stay close to the house until you get used to the area. The desert can be dangerous if you do not know what you are doing. We will be careful, Lillian assured him, and we will stay busy. I can see there is plenty of work to be done. Something that might have been relief crossed Quinton's face. I will leave you to get settled then. I need to unload the wagon and tend to the horses. If you could manage something for supper, I would appreciate it. I have been living on beans and hardtack for longer than I care to admit. I will make a proper meal, Lillian promised. We may not have much, but we will have good food on the table. After Quinton left to attend to his work, Lillian gathered the children and began the process of settling into their new home. She unpacked their few belongings, made up beds for the children on the floor using blankets from the trunk at the foot of the big bed, and then returned to the kitchen to assess the supplies and plan supper. The pantry was indeed well stocked with basics: flour, cornmeal, beans, salt, sugar, coffee, and various canned goods. In the root cellar, she found onions, potatoes, and carrots that were slightly wrinkled but still usable. There was bacon hanging in the cool darkness, and a jar of sourdough starter that had been faithfully maintained. With these ingredients, she could work wonders. She set Emma to work collecting eggs from the chicken coop while she started a fire in the stove and began preparing biscuits. Thomas helped by bringing in wood for the fire, proud of being given an important job, while Sarah sat on the floor playing with a wooden spoon and making up songs. The familiar routine of cooking soothed Lillian's nerves and made this strange new place feel a little more like home. By the time the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, Lillian had prepared a feast by frontier standards. Bacon and fried potatoes, fresh biscuits with butter, beans seasoned with onion and a bit of molasses, and dried apple pie made from supplies she found in the pantry. The table was set properly with mismatched plates and cups, and the children were washed and ready to eat. Quinton came in from his work dusty and tired, and stopped dead when he saw the table laden with food and smelled the aromas filling the house. For a long moment, he just stood there, and Lillian saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "I hope you are hungry," she said softly. "The children and I wanted to show our appreciation for the chance you are giving us." "I cannot remember the last time," he started, then stopped and shook his head. "This looks wonderful, thank you. Let me just wash up and I will join you." He disappeared outside to the pump, and when he returned with his face and hands clean and his hair damp, Lillian had already seated the children and was dishing out portions. Quinton took his seat at the head of the table, looking uncertain, as if he had forgotten what it was like to share a meal with other people. "Would you like to say grace?" Lillian asked. Quinton hesitated, then cleared his throat and bowed his head. "Lord, we thank you for this food and for the hands that prepared it. We ask your blessing on this household and all who dwell here. Amen." "Amen," Lillian and the children echoed. The meal began quietly, with only the sounds of eating and the occasional request to pass something. But gradually, Thomas began chattering about all the things he had seen that day, and Emma shyly asked Quinton about the horses, and even Sarah contributed her baby babble to the conversation. Lillian watched Quinton's face as he answered the children's questions, seeing the stiffness gradually leave his shoulders and the faintest hint of a smile touch his lips. When the meal was finished and the pie had been devoured with obvious appreciation, Quinton leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. "That was the best meal I have had in years," he said quietly. "You have a real gift, Lillian. She felt warmth bloom in her chest at the compliment. "I am glad you enjoyed it. There will be plenty more where that came from." After supper, Lillian insisted that Quinton rest while she cleaned up, and though he protested half-heartedly, she could see that he was exhausted from a long day of work. She washed the dishes with Emma's help while Thomas swept the floor and Sarah played nearby. By the time the kitchen was spotless and the children were dressed for bed, the desert night had fallen completely, bringing with it a coolness that was a relief after the heat of the day. Lillian tucked the children into their makeshift beds, kissing each one goodnight and listening to their prayers. They were asleep within minutes, worn out by travel and excitement, and the security of knowing they had a roof over their heads and full bellies. She returned to the main room to find Quinton still sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in his hands and a distant look in his eyes. He glanced up when she entered, and some of the distance cleared from his expression. "Children settled?" he asked. "Yes, they were exhausted. It has been a very long few days for them." She hesitated, then moved to sit across from him at the table. "I want to thank you again for taking a chance on us. I know we are not what you expected when you mentioned needing help, but I promise you will not regret this decision." Quinton studied her face in the lamplight, and Lillian found herself unable to look away. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black in the dim light, and there was something in them that made her breath catch. "I almost said no," he admitted. "When Margaret called me over and I saw you standing there with 3 children, my first instinct was to make an excuse and leave. I did not want the complication, did not want to risk caring about people again only to lose them." He paused, turning the coffee cup in his hands. "But then you looked at me with such determination, such fierce need to protect your children, and I could not turn away. My wife used to look at me like that sometimes, like she would move mountains if that is what it took to keep our family safe. I guess I respected that too much to ignore it." Lillian felt tears prick at her eyes at his honesty. "What was her name?" "Your wife, Clara. She was beautiful and stubborn and braver than any woman I ever met. We were only married 3 years before she got pregnant. The baby came early and there were complications. I rode to town for the doctor, but by the time we got back, both of them were gone." His voice was steady, but Lillian could hear the grief underneath, old and worn but still present. "That was 2 years ago. My mother came to help afterward, but she had a bad heart and the exertion of running the ranch was too much. She passed in her sleep last April. Since then, it has just been me." "I am so sorry," Lillian whispered. "Losing people you love, it never really stops hurting, does it?" "No," Quinton agreed, "but you learn to carry it better, and you keep going because that is what they would have wanted." He looked at her directly. "Your husband, what was he like?" "Jacob was kind and gentle and completely impractical," Lillian said with a sad smile. "He was a clerk who dreamed of being a writer, always scribbling stories and poems in his spare time. He was not built for hardship, and when the influenza came through our neighborhood, he could not fight it off. I think part of him just gave up, and that was the worst part, watching him slip away and being powerless to stop it." She folded her hands on the table. "He was a good father, though. He loved the children so much. I think he would be glad to know that I found a way to give them stability and safety." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 people who had each suffered loss and were trying to find their way forward. Then Quinton stood and carried his cup to the wash basin. "We should both get some sleep. Morning comes early on a ranch, and I expect you will have your hands full tomorrow getting everything organized the way you want it." "I am looking forward to it," Lillian said, and she meant it. For the first time in over a year, she felt like she had a purpose beyond mere survival. That night, lying in the big bed in the room that had once been meant as a nursery, Lillian listened to her children's soft breathing and felt something close to peace settle over her. They were safe. They had food and shelter and the promise of stability. It was more than she had dared hope for when she stepped off that stagecoach yesterday. And if her last thoughts before sleep claimed her were of the quiet, lonely man in the next room who had shown her unexpected kindness, well, that was her own business and nobody else's. The next weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm that surprised Lillian with how naturally it developed. She rose before dawn to start coffee and prepare breakfast, and by the time Quinton came in from his first round of chores, there was always hot food waiting on the table. The children adapted quickly to ranch life, with Emma proving herself helpful in the kitchen and with minding her younger siblings, while Thomas followed Quinton around like a devoted shadow whenever he was allowed, eager to learn everything about ranch work. Lillian threw herself into transforming the house from a bachelor's survival space into a real home. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed, washed every dish and piece of fabric she could find, organized the pantry with military efficiency, and coaxed the struggling vegetable garden back to productive life with careful watering and weeding. She sewed curtains from fabric she found in a trunk that had belonged to Quinton's mother, and suddenly the rooms felt softer and more welcoming. She baked bread every other day, made proper meals 3 times a day, and even managed to prepare special treats like cookies and cakes that made the children squeal with delight. But more than the physical transformation of the house, Lillian found herself transforming the atmosphere. She filled the silence with gentle conversation and the children's laughter. She asked Quinton about his day and listened with genuine interest as he talked about the cattle or the land or the repairs that needed doing. She noticed when he was particularly tired and made sure his favorite foods appeared on the table. She mended his clothes with careful stitches and made sure he always had clean shirts ready. And slowly, gradually, she watched him come back to life. It started with small things. The way his shoulders relaxed when he walked into the house and smelled supper cooking. The almost smile that touched his lips when Thomas asked him an endless stream of questions. The way he began lingering at the table after meals, talking about nothing in particular instead of rushing back to work. The sound of his rare, rusty laugh when Sarah did something adorable. One evening about 3 weeks after their arrival, Lillian was washing dishes while Quinton sat at the table helping Emma practice her letters. He was patient with her stumbling efforts, his deep voice gentle as he sounded out words and praised her progress. Thomas was already asleep on the floor of the bedroom, worn out from a day of helping with ranch chores, and Sarah dozed in Lillian's makeshift cradle near the fireplace. Watching them together, Quinton's dark head bent close to Emma's fair one as they worked through a simple reader. Lillian felt something shift in her chest. It was more than gratitude, more than appreciation for his kindness to her children. It was the warm, fluttering feeling of attraction, of genuine affection growing into something deeper. She tried to push the feeling away, reminding herself that she was his employee, that he had hired her to manage his household, not to develop romantic feelings for him. But the heart was not so easily controlled, and she could not deny that every day she found herself more drawn to this quiet, strong man who had given them sanctuary when they had nowhere else to turn. Quinton looked up and caught her watching, and something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that made Lillian's breath catch. His eyes held hers for a long moment, and she saw her own feelings reflected back at her, uncertainty and longing, and the fear of risking one's heart again. Then Emma tugged on his sleeve to ask about the next word, and the moment passed, but Lillian knew that something had fundamentally changed between them. The question was what they would do about it. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Quinton asked her to sit with him on the front porch where it was cooler. They sat in the wooden chairs he had made himself, listening to the night sounds of the desert and watching the stars wheel overhead in the clear, dark sky. "I want to tell you something," Quinton said after a long silence. "When I lost Clara and the baby, I thought I was done with feeling anything. I locked up that part of myself and threw away the key. It was easier to be numb than to risk that kind of pain again. And then you came along with your children and your determination, and you did not ask permission before you started breathing life back into this place. Into me." Lillian's heart was pounding so hard she felt certain he must be able to hear it. "Quinton," she started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. I know you came here looking for work, and I know you are in a vulnerable position, dependent on my goodwill for your children's welfare. I would never want to take advantage of that or make you uncomfortable. But I need you to know that somewhere along the way, this stopped being just an employment arrangement for me. I look forward to coming into the house and seeing you there. I find myself listening for your voice and your laughter. When I watch you with your children, I feel things I thought I would never feel again." He turned to look at her directly, his expression open and honest in the starlight. "I am not saying this to pressure you or to expect anything from you. I just needed you to know that you have become important to me. All of you have. This house feels like a home again, and that is because of what you have brought to it." Lillian felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy. "I am so glad you said something, because I have been feeling the same way and trying so hard not to. I did not want to presume, did not want to risk making things awkward when we have to live under the same roof. But Quinton, you have given us more than just shelter and work. You have given us safety and kindness and the space to heal from our own losses. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I started to care for you. More than I should, probably more than is wise, but I cannot seem to help it." Quinton reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong as they wrapped around hers. "Then maybe we can stop trying to help it and see where this goes. Nice and slow, no pressure, just seeing if what we are feeling has room to grow into something real." "I would like that," Lillian whispered. "I would like that very much." They sat there holding hands under the stars, and it felt like a promise, like the beginning of something worth building. Neither of them spoke for a long time, content simply to be together, to acknowledge what was growing between them without rushing or forcing it. Finally, Quinton squeezed her hand gently and stood. "We should get some sleep. Morning will come whether we are ready or not." "It always does," Lillian agreed with a soft smile. She rose from her chair, and on impulse she stood on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Good night, Quinton." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "Good night, Lillian." They parted to their separate rooms, but Lillian lay awake for a long time, her fingers touching the hand he had held, her heart full of hope for the first time since Jacob had died. The summer days grew hotter, and the work on the ranch became more demanding, but Lillian and her children adapted to the rhythm of frontier life with surprising ease. Emma learned to collect eggs and feed the chickens without being asked, taking pride in her responsibilities. Thomas was allowed to help with simple chores under Quinton's supervision, and he glowed with pride every time Quinton praised his efforts. Even little Sarah was helpful in her own way, entertaining herself quietly while Lillian worked and always ready with sticky-handed hugs and kisses. Quinton began teaching Thomas how to ride on the gentlest of the ranch horses, a patient mare named Clover, who tolerated the boy's inexpert handling with good grace. Lillian watched from the porch as Quinton led the horse around the corral with Thomas sitting tall in the saddle, his face split by an enormous grin. The patience and care Quinton showed her son made her heart swell with affection. One afternoon in late July, after the worst heat of the day had passed, Quinton suggested they all ride out to a spot about a mile from the ranch house where a spring fed a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees. "It is one of the prettiest places on the property," he explained. "Clara used to love it there. I thought maybe you and the children would enjoy seeing it." They loaded supplies into a wagon, including a picnic supper Lillian had prepared, and set out across the scrubland. The children were excited by the adventure, pointing out every lizard and bird they spotted along the way. Quinton drove with easy confidence, and Lillian sat beside him, comfortable with the casual way their shoulders bumped together as the wagon jostled over rough ground. The spring was indeed beautiful, a green oasis in the harsh desert landscape. Water bubbled up from between rocks and collected in a clear pool before trickling away to disappear back into the thirsty earth. The cottonwood trees provided shade, and the sound of their leaves rustling in the breeze was like music. The children immediately ran to the water's edge, and Quinton helped them remove their shoes so they could wade in the shallow areas, while he and Lillian kept close watch. The water was cool and clean, and the delighted shrieks of the children echoed across the quiet landscape. Lillian spread a blanket under the trees and began setting out the food she had brought. Quinton settled beside her, close enough that their arms touched, and they sat in comfortable silence watching the children play. "Clara and I used to talk about bringing our children here someday," Quinton said quietly. "We had so many plans, so many dreams about the family we would build together. When I lost her, I thought those dreams died too. I stopped coming here because it hurt too much to remember what might have been." Lillian turned to look at him, seeing the old grief in his eyes but also something new, something like acceptance. "And now I am glad I brought you here. It feels right, sharing this place with you and your children. Like maybe those dreams did not die, they just changed shape. They became something different from what I expected, but no less valuable." He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I am falling in love with you, Lillian. I fought against it at first, tried to tell myself it was too soon, too complicated, too risky. But I cannot fight it anymore, and I do not want to." Lillian felt her breath catch, felt tears well up in her eyes even as her heart soared. "I am falling in love with you too. I think I have been for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it, afraid of what it might mean. But life is too short and too uncertain to waste time being afraid. I love you, Quinton. I love your kindness and your strength, and the way you have opened your heart to not just me but to my children as well." Quinton cupped her face in both hands and looked at her with such intensity that she felt stripped bare, vulnerable in the best possible way. "I want to build a real family with you. I want to marry you if you will have me. I want to be a father to Emma and Thomas and Sarah, to give them my name and my protection and all the love I have to give. And maybe, if God wills it, we can have more children together, fill this ranch with the life and laughter it was always meant to hold." "Yes," Lillian whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes to all of it. Yes to marrying you, yes to building a family together, yes to whatever future we can create. I never thought I would get a second chance at happiness, but here you are, offering me everything I thought I had lost forever." Quinton kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was different from the kisses Jacob had given her, more mature, more grounded in the knowledge of life's hardships and the preciousness of connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "Mama," Thomas's voice rang out across the clearing. "Look how far I can throw a stone," They both laughed, the spell broken but the magic remaining. "We should probably make sure he does not knock himself or his sisters into the water," Lillian said, but she made no move to stand immediately. "In a minute," Quinton agreed, and he kissed her once more, quick and joyful, before they both rose to join the children by the water. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the spring, eating their picnic supper and letting the children play until they were pleasantly worn out. As the sun began to set, they loaded back into the wagon and made their way home through the cooling evening air. The children fell asleep in the back, and Lillian leaned against Quinton's shoulder, feeling utterly content. "When should we get married?" she asked softly. "As soon as possible," Quinton replied without hesitation. "I do not see any reason to wait. We know what we want, and we have both been through enough to understand what marriage means. We could go into town next Saturday and talk to the preacher. If he is available, maybe we could do it right then, simple and quick." "I would like that," Lillian agreed. "I do not need a fancy wedding or a big celebration. I just want to be your wife to make this official and real." The following Saturday, they made the journey into Hachita with all three children dressed in their best clothes and their hair neatly combed. Quinton had polished his boots and put on a clean shirt and jacket, and he looked so handsome that Lillian's heart skipped when she looked at him. She wore her good dress, the one she had saved for special occasions, and had pinned her hair up in a simple but elegant style. Margaret was delighted to see them and immediately understood their purpose when she spotted their formal attire. "Finally coming to your senses, are you?" she said with a knowing smile. "About time." The preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Thomas, was happy to perform the ceremony that very afternoon in the small church at the edge of town. Margaret and the store owner's husband served as witnesses, and the children stood solemn and wide-eyed as they watched their mother marry the man who had become so important to all of them. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Quinton kissed Lillian for the first time as her husband, she felt like her heart might burst from happiness. This was nothing like her first wedding, a nervous affair conducted by a judge's clerk with no family present, because neither she nor Jacob had any money. This felt real and solid and right, a commitment made by two people who understood exactly what they were promising each other. After the ceremony, Margaret insisted on hosting a small celebration at the general store, producing a cake she had somehow managed to bake that morning and cool drinks for everyone. Other townspeople stopped by to offer congratulations, and Lillian was touched by their genuine warmth and welcome. As the afternoon wore into evening and they prepared to make the journey back to the ranch, Quinton helped Lillian into the wagon and whispered in her ear, "I cannot wait to get you home, Mrs. Keller." She shivered with anticipation and happiness. Mrs. Keller. She had a new name, a new life, and a new chance at everything she thought she had lost. That night, after the children were safely asleep in their room, Lillian and Quinton finally came together as husband and wife in the privacy of his bedroom, which was now their bedroom. Their lovemaking was tender and passionate, a celebration of their commitment and the feelings that had been building between them for months. Afterward, lying in Quinton's arms with her head on his chest and his fingers trailing through her hair, Lillian felt more at peace than she had in years. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Quinton replied, his voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "Thank you for taking a chance on a broken-down cowboy with nothing much to offer but hard work and a lonely ranch." Lillian lifted her head to look at him, even though she could barely see his face in the dark. "You gave me everything that matters. Safety, security, love, a home. You gave my children a father and me a partner. That is not nothing, Quinton. That is everything." He pulled her closer, and she settled back against him with a contented sigh. Tomorrow they would return to the work of running the ranch. But tonight they could simply be together, reveling in the knowledge that they had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ruins of their separate sorrows. The months that followed their wedding were some of the happiest of Lillian's life. She had never imagined that loving someone the second time around could feel so different yet so right. With Jacob, everything had been young and idealistic, both of them too naive to understand what they were getting into. With Quinton, love was grounded in reality, built on mutual respect and shared responsibilities, and the knowledge that life was hard but bearable when you faced it together. Quinton was an attentive husband, always considerate of her needs and generous with his affection. He made sure she knew every day that she was valued and loved, whether through words or small gestures like bringing her wildflowers from the rangeland, or making sure she had time to rest when she was particularly tired. He was also a wonderful father to her children, patient with their mistakes and encouraging of their efforts, treating them exactly as if they were his own blood. Emma, in particular, blossomed under Quinton's attention. She had been so solemn after Jacob's death, carrying responsibilities beyond her years as she tried to help her mother cope. But now, with the security of knowing they had a stable home and a father who would protect them, she began to act like a child again, laughing and playing with her siblings, and occasionally even being a little mischievous in the way 7-year-olds should be. Thomas worshipped Quinton completely, following him everywhere and mimicking his every gesture. Under Quinton's tutelage, he was becoming quite the little ranch hand, capable of feeding animals and collecting eggs, and even helping with simple repairs. Quinton never lost patience with the boy's endless questions and mistakes, instead using every situation as a teaching opportunity. Even Sarah, who had been too young to really remember Jacob, adopted Quinton as her father without question. She called him Papa within weeks of the wedding, and the first time she did it, Lillian watched Quinton's eyes fill with tears even as he smiled and scooped the little girl into his arms. As autumn arrived and the brutal heat of summer finally eased, Lillian began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before saying anything to Quinton, wanting to be sure before raising his hopes. When she finally told him one evening after the children were in bed, he went very still and then pulled her into his arms with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "As sure as I can be. I have been through this enough times to recognize the signs, probably due sometime in early May." She pulled back to look at his face. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Quinton said, and she could see the joy and wonder shining in his eyes. "After Clara, I thought I would never have this chance again. A child of our own, created from our love. It feels like a miracle." "It feels like a new beginning," Lillian agreed. She hesitated, then added, "I know it must bring back painful memories, though. I do not want you to spend the next months worrying about history repeating itself." Quinton cupped her face in his hands, his expression serious. "I will not lie and say I am not a little scared, but I also know that fear is no way to live. We will take every precaution. Get the doctor out here well before your time. Make sure you have everything you need. And we will trust that God will see us through this, just as He has seen us through everything else." True to his word, Quinton became almost comically protective as Lillian's pregnancy progressed. He insisted she rest more, refused to let her lift anything heavy, and fussed over her diet and comfort to a degree that was both touching and occasionally exasperating. But Lillian endured it with good humor, knowing that it came from a place of love and the fear of losing another person he cared about. The children were thrilled at the prospect of a new baby brother or sister. Emma immediately began planning how she would help take care of the infant, while Thomas announced with complete confidence that it would definitely be a boy, so he would have someone to play with. Sarah was just excited to be included in the anticipation, even if she did not fully understand what was happening. Winter came to the New Mexico desert, not as harsh as winters in St. Louis, but cold enough to require fires in the fireplace and extra blankets on the beds. Lillian spent the short, cold days preparing for the baby's arrival, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, organizing supplies, and making sure everything was ready. Quinton brought in the doctor from town to examine her in January, and the doctor pronounced both mother and baby healthy and strong. As the months passed and Lillian's belly grew round with their child, Quinton would often place his hand on her stomach to feel the baby move. The wonder on his face during those moments never failed to make Lillian's heart swell with love. This strong, capable man who had survived so much loss was getting a second chance at fatherhood, and she was determined to give him the experience he had been denied the first time. Spring arrived with wildflowers carpeting the desert and new calves being born to the ranch cattle. Lillian felt as ripe and ready as the land around her, moving more slowly but still determined to keep up with her responsibilities. Quinton had hired a young man from town to help with the heavier ranch work, so he could stay closer to the house as Lillian's due date approached, unwilling to be caught too far away when her time came. On a warm May afternoon, while Lillian was kneading bread dough and the children played outside under Quinton's watchful eye, she felt the first unmistakable tightening of a contraction. She paused, waiting to see if another would follow, and when it did about 15 minutes later, she knew it was time. She walked to the door and called out calmly, "Quinton, I think you should send someone for the doctor now." His head snapped up, and she saw the flash of fear cross his face before he got it under control. He quickly organized the hired hand to ride for the doctor while he gathered the children and brought them inside, setting them up with activities to keep them occupied and out of the way. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his hands hovering over her as if he wanted to touch her but was afraid he might break her. "I am fine," Lillian assured him with a calm smile. "This is my 4th time, remember? I know what to expect and everything feels normal and right. Do not worry so much." "Easy for you to say," Quinton muttered, but he helped her to the bedroom and made sure she was comfortable. The labor progressed steadily through the afternoon and into the evening. The doctor arrived with plenty of time to spare, and he confirmed that everything was proceeding normally. Quinton stayed by Lillian's side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with a cool cloth and murmuring encouragement during the worst of the contractions. Finally, just as the sun was setting and painting their bedroom in shades of gold and orange, Lillian gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The doctor placed the squalling infant in her arms, and she looked down at her son with tears streaming down her face. He was perfect, with a full head of dark hair like his father and tiny fists that waved indignantly at being thrust into the cold world. "Quinton, meet your son," she said softly, looking up at her husband who stood frozen beside the bed, staring at the baby with an expression of such intense emotion that it was almost painful to witness. "He is really here," Quinton whispered, reaching out with a shaking hand to touch the baby's tiny fingers. "He is really alive and healthy." "He is perfect," Lillian confirmed. "Do you want to hold him?" The doctor cleaned up the baby a bit and then carefully transferred him into Quinton's arms. The big cowboy held his son with the utmost care, as if the infant were made of glass, and looked down at him with tears running unashamedly down his face. "Hello, little one," Quinton said, his voice breaking. "I am your papa, and I promise I will do everything in my power to keep you safe and loved and happy for all of your days." Lillian watched them together and felt her heart might burst from happiness. After everything they had both been through, after all the loss and pain and uncertainty, they had arrived at this moment of perfect joy. After a few minutes, Quinton carefully returned the baby to Lillian so he could nurse, and then Quinton went to bring the other children in to meet their new brother. Emma, Thomas, and Sarah crowded around the bed, eyes wide with wonder as they stared at the tiny infant. "He is so small," Emma breathed. "You were all that small once," Lillian told her with a smile. "He will grow quickly, you will see." "What is his name?" Thomas wanted to know. Lillian looked at Quinton and they shared a smile. They had discussed names endlessly over the past months, unable to decide until they actually met their child. But now, looking at this dark-haired baby boy with his father's strong features, the answer was obvious. "His name is James Robert Keller," Quinton said. "James for strength, and Robert after your uncle who brought your mama to New Mexico, even if he was not here to see it happen." "James," Emma repeated, testing out the name. "I like it. Hello, baby James." The infant yawned enormously, and everyone laughed at the comical expression on his tiny face. The doctor finished his work and gave final instructions before departing, satisfied that both mother and baby were doing well. After he left, Quinton shooed the older children off to bed, promising they could spend more time with their new brother tomorrow. When they were finally alone, Quinton lay down carefully on the bed beside Lillian and their son, one arm wrapped protectively around both of them. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for giving me this gift, for trusting me enough to build this family with me. I know I do not always have the words to express what I feel, but I hope you know that you and these children are everything to me." "I know," Lillian whispered back, resting her head against his shoulder. "And you are everything to us. We were lost when we arrived here, and you gave us a home. You gave us love. You gave us a future." "We gave each other all those things," Quinton corrected gently. "You saved me just as much as I saved you." They lay together in the gathering darkness, listening to the soft sounds of their newborn son and feeling the quiet contentment of a family complete. Outside, the desert night settled over the ranch, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the rising moon. The weeks after James's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, but they were also suffused with a joy that made all the exhaustion worthwhile. Quinton was a devoted father, waking with Lillian for nighttime feedings and changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with a fussy baby, so Lillian could get a few hours of uninterrupted rest. The older children were remarkably helpful, with Emma especially taking her role as big sister very seriously. As spring turned to summer, and James grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, alert infant who smiled at everyone and everything, the ranch thrived. The cattle multiplied, the garden produced abundantly, and the work was hard but satisfying. Lillian had never been happier, surrounded by her children and the man she loved, building a life that felt solid and real and permanent. One evening in late July, almost exactly 2 years after she had first arrived in Hachita with 3 children and no husband, Lillian stood on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Quinton came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on the top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I am thinking about how different my life is now compared to when I stepped off that stagecoach," she said softly. "I was so scared then, so uncertain about everything. I had no idea that the dusty cowboy who agreed to hire me would become the love of my life. That dusty cowboy had no idea what he was getting into either," Quinton said with a quiet laugh. I thought I was hiring help. Instead, I got a wife, 4 children, and more happiness than I knew what to do with." "You ever regret it?" Lillian asked, turning in his arms to look up at his face. "Taking on a widow with 3 children when you could have had a much simpler life?" "Not for one single second," Quinton said firmly, his dark eyes intense as they met hers. "You and the children are the best thing that ever happened to me. You brought me back to life when I thought I was done living. How could I ever regret that?" Lillian stood on her toes and kissed him, long and sweet and full of all the love that filled her heart to overflowing. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest and smiled. "I love you, Quinton Keller. I love the life we have built and the family we have created. I love waking up next to you every morning and falling asleep in your arms every night. I love watching you with our children and knowing that they are safe and loved and exactly where they belong." "I love you too, Lillian Keller," Quinton replied, tightening his arms around her. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. You are my heart, my home, my everything." They stood together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. 2 people who had found each other when both were lost, and who had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. Inside the house, they could hear Emma reading a story to Thomas and Sarah, and from the bedroom came the soft sounds of baby James beginning to wake from his nap. "We should go in," Lillian said reluctantly, not quite ready to leave the peaceful moment but knowing that duty called. "In a minute," Quinton said, exactly as he had that first day at the spring. "Let me hold you just a little longer." So they stood there in the gathering darkness, holding each other and listening to the sounds of their family. And Lillian thought about the words she had heard the cowboy say that first day in Hachita, though he had never actually spoken them aloud. She had arrived with 3 children and no husband, desperate and alone, and the cowboy had looked at her and somehow seen past the desperation to the possibility. "Now you have both," his actions had said. "Now you have both," and she did. She had her children, safe and thriving. She had a husband who loved her with a depth and constancy that still took her breath away. She had a home, a real home, not just a roof over their heads but a place where they belonged and were cherished. She had a future that stretched out bright and full of promise, no longer shadowed by fear and uncertainty. The years rolled on, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. James grew into a sturdy, cheerful toddler who followed his older siblings around with determined steps, wanting to be part of everything they did. Emma blossomed into a capable and kind young lady who helped her mother with increasing skill and maturity. Thomas became Quinton's right hand on the ranch, learning everything his father could teach him about ranching and livestock, and the hard work required to make a living from the land. Even Sarah, the baby of the original 3, grew into a sweet and helpful child who had a special gift for calming frightened animals and making everyone around her smile. 2 years after James was born, Lillian gave birth to another son, whom they named Henry, and then 2 years after that, a daughter they called Grace. The ranch house that had once seemed so empty and lonely was now bursting with life and laughter and the beautiful chaos of a large family. Quinton proved to be as devoted a father to all 6 children as he had promised to be that first day. He made no distinction between the children Lillian had brought with her and those they had created together. To him, they were all his, and he loved them all with the fierce protective love of a man who understood how precious and fragile family truly was. As the children grew, so did the ranch. Quinton expanded the cattle operation, built additional outbuildings, and began training horses to sell, a venture that Thomas took to with particular enthusiasm. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and secure, with enough to meet their needs and occasionally a little extra for small luxuries. Lillian continued to run the household with the same efficiency and love she had brought to it from the first day. The house was always clean and welcoming. The meals were always hearty and delicious, and there was always a sense of warmth and belonging that made everyone who visited comment on what a happy home the Kellers had. Margaret from the general store became a regular visitor and dear friend, often bringing treats for the children and staying for long conversations over coffee with Lillian. The people of Hachita came to know and respect the Keller family, and Lillian found herself part of a community in a way she had never experienced in the anonymous crowds of St. Louis. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Quinton surprised Lillian by taking her back to the spring where he had first told her he loved her. They left the children in Emma's capable care for a few hours and rode out together, just the two of them, to the green oasis that held such special meaning for them both. They spread a blanket under the cottonwood trees and lay together in the dappled shade, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. Quinton had brought a small wrapped package, which he presented to her with an almost shy expression. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. When Lillian opened it, she found 2 tiny photographs, one of Quinton and one of herself with all the children gathered around her. "I wanted you to have something beautiful," Quinton said, "something that represents what we have built together. I had a jeweler in Las Cruces make it special." The pictures were taken from that photograph we had done last year. Lillian felt tears slip down her cheeks as she fastened the locket around her neck. "It is perfect," she whispered. "I will treasure it always." 5 years ago I was barely living," Quinton said, pulling her close against his side. "I was going through the motions, but there was no joy, no hope, no real purpose beyond simple survival. And then you arrived with your children and your courage and everything changed. You gave me back my life, Lillian. You gave me a reason to wake up in the morning and look forward to the day ahead. You gave me love and family and happiness I thought I would never have again." "You gave me all those same things," Lillian replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "I was broken when I came here, frightened and desperate and barely holding myself together. You gave me safety and security, but more than that, you gave me yourself. You opened your heart even though you had every reason to keep it closed. You took on not just me, but 3 children who were not yours by blood, and you loved us all so completely that we healed. That is an incredible gift, Quinton. One I will be grateful for every single day for the rest of my life." They kissed then, long and slow and deep, a reaffirmation of vows and promises and the love that had grown stronger with each passing year. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, eyes bright with emotion and happiness. "We should probably get back before the children burn down the house," Lillian said with a laugh, though she made no move to stand. "Probably," Quinton agreed, also not moving. "But not just yet. Let me hold you a little longer." So they lay together by the spring, listening to the sound of water and leaves and each other's breathing, and felt the perfect contentment of 2 people who had found exactly where they belonged. As the years continued to pass, the Keller family became a fixture in the area, known for their hard work, their kindness, and the obvious love that bound them together. Emma grew into a beautiful young woman who eventually married a rancher's son from a neighboring property, and she and her husband built their own place just a few miles from the Keller ranch, ensuring she remained close to her family. Thomas stayed on the ranch, becoming a full partner in the operation, and showing every sign of eventually taking over completely when Quinton was ready to step back. Sarah, the sweet-natured child, grew into a young woman with a gift for teaching, and she eventually opened a small school in Hachita, educating the children of ranch families and townspeople alike. James and Henry both showed their father's talent for ranching and horses, while little Grace, the baby of the family, proved to have her mother's head for numbers and organization, keeping the ranch accounts with meticulous care even as a young girl. Through all the years, through all the changes and challenges, Quinton and Lillian remained as devoted to each other as they had been in those early days when they first acknowledged their feelings. They worked side by side, raised their children with love and discipline, and built a legacy that extended far beyond themselves. On warm evenings, they would still sit together on the front porch, holding hands and watching the sun set over the desert they had both come to love. Sometimes they talked about the past, remembering how far they had come and how unlikely their happiness had once seemed. Sometimes they talked about the future, making plans for the ranch and speculating about grandchildren and what the next generation would bring. And sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, content to be together, needing no words to express what they felt. One evening, when Quinton was in his early 50s and Lillian in her late 40s, they sat together watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Emma had brought her 2 children for a visit, and the older Keller children were entertaining them with stories and games while baby Grace, no longer such a baby at 14, supervised with maternal authority. "We did all right, did we not?" Quinton said, gesturing to the scene before them. "We did better than all right," Lillian replied with a satisfied smile. "We created something beautiful and lasting. A family, a home, a legacy of love. All because you stepped off that stagecoach with 3 scared children and enough courage to face down an uncertain future," Quinton said, squeezing her hand. "All because a lonely cowboy decided to take a chance on a widow who had nothing to offer but herself and her children," Lillian countered. They looked at each other and smiled, the same smile they had shared 100,000 times over the years, full of love and understanding and the bone-deep knowledge that they had found something precious and rare. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Lillian leaned her head on Quinton's shoulder and thought about that frightened woman who had arrived in Hachita with 3 children and no husband, with no prospects and no plan beyond desperate hope. She thought about the cowboy who had looked at her and seen not a burden but a possibility, who had opened his home and his heart and given her everything she needed to rebuild her life. She had arrived with 3 children and no husband. The cowboy had said, through his actions and his love and his unwavering commitment, that now she had both. She had children, safe and loved and thriving, and she had a husband, a partner, a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. As darkness fell, and the family began to move inside for supper, Lillian and Quinton remained on the porch a moment longer, holding hands and watching the stars appear one by one in the vast New Mexico sky. They had built a good life together, had taken 2 broken stories and woven them into something whole and beautiful. They had loved and been loved, had raised children and built a home, had faced hardships and celebrated triumphs. And through it all, they had had each other. That, in the end, was all that really mattered. They had found each other when both were lost, and together, they had created something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love and family and the courage to take chances on hope. Finally, they rose from their chairs and walked inside together, hand in hand, ready to share another meal with their family, to tuck grandchildren into bed alongside their own youngest, to fall asleep in each other's arms as they had done every night for more than 2 decades. The house was warm and bright, filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation and life. And as Lillian looked around at all they had built, at the family they had created from loss and loneliness, She felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, for the man who had given her a second chance, for the life they had built together from nothing more than hope and determination and love. She had arrived with 3 children and no husband, desperate and afraid. Now she had both, plus so much more. She had a family, a home, a future bright with promise and rich with love. She had found her place in this harsh, beautiful land, and she had found her partner, her love, her heart. And that, she thought as Quinton pulled her close for a kiss before they joined their children at the table, was everything she had ever hoped for and more than she had ever dared to dream. The end.